Just want to welcome, if there's any persons that are in the public gallery that's associated with Bessborough development, to welcome them here to the chamber. We now move on to the next speaking slot, a 15-minute slot for Sinn Féin Party. 3 speakers: Deputy O'Leary, Deputy Clark and Deputy Gould. Deputy O'Leary, 5 minutes.
Minister, I'm going to talk about Bessborough, but I'm also going to talk about the entire system in terms of mother and baby homes, industrial schools and county homes, because we've had so many apologies in this House, and rightly so, and welcome. But too often I feel that the state has failed to truly get to grips with what was actually in place in this state, and that is an entire system that was integrated between county homes, between Magdalen laundries, between mother and baby homes, between industrial schools. That was, to say it was a dark period of our history is an understatement, and I return to that because it isn't merely history. But this was an entire system that had the imprimatur of the state, that the state was entirely complicit in. And the state's response has always been to treat it as piecemeal, a bit of wrongdoing here, these institutions were wrong here, instead of really confronting the fact that the state fully endorsed and fully was part of the system, and to a large extent relied on the system. I also think that there hasn't been a frank and honest recognition of the pain that was caused, and I think the most obvious example of that was the heartlessness of the 6-month limit for compensation under the mother and baby home scheme, as if the trauma of separation was any less for those who fell under that bracket, as if that separation, we know now very clearly that trauma exists right from birth, and that separation that would have been created, I think it was one of the most callous proposals and decisions adopted by any government in recent years. And to look at Bessborough, how it puts it into stark repair. Yes, we can all acknowledge the fact that maternal health in the 40s and 50s in Ireland was not what it should have been. But to say that the standards in Bessborough fell below that doesn't even begin to cover it. Public health reports looking at an infant mortality rate of 82% in some years in the 40s. That the cause of death of some 20% of the deaths in Bessborough in the 40s and 50s was marasmus, a form of severe malnutrition. People dying in Cork in the 40s and 50s in Bessborough for want of food, for want of nutrition. But it's important to say as well that this is not only history, and we would make a profound mistake to treat this as only a period that can be looked back on and to be examined in a historical context. There are people in this gallery, there are people watching in, whose brothers, sisters, mothers were in Bessborough. And for those people, this is profoundly real. And this is about being able to identify where their loved ones were buried. That is what we're talking about. I was at an oral hearing for one of the previous applications, thankfully refused, and I remember a debate between esteemed, capable people who had different opinions on how to interpret old Ordnance Survey maps. I'm trying to say that one set of experts was trying to say, well, the marking there for burial ground represents the Order's burial ground over here, and another expert saying that no, very clearly, this burial ground could potentially have been there. But which of them was right? The point of it, and what stayed with me since then, is that this was no ordinary housing application. This was a housing application that was talking about whether or not there were children buried there. That was the fundamental point. And it is no ordinary planning application before us now where that has been discussed. I know it's not strictly before us. It is profoundly wrong and is hurtful to build there. And I know the government will say that they can't interfere in planning locations, but there could have been a government intervention with the Institutional Burials Bill. And it's not only in Bessborough, it's in Shanbaross and other locations across the state. The government should have recognised we've been talking about this issue in these houses in terms of the institutions and where children were buried. Some 700 children who died at Bessborough are unaccounted for. We don't know where they're buried. It's absolutely appalling. And this is in the context of, you know, I've talked about the state's complicity in this. You know, a story just reported today that the state chief medical advisor, James Deaney, communicated to Bessborough that they would put aside their investigation if the death rate continues to decline. That's what we're talking about here. And we're talking about the potential burial place of children. So the government needs to find some legislative mechanism to ensure that sites such as this and across the state are protected, because this isn't the only location.
Deputy Clerk.